He came bearing gifts, but as Vladimir Putin gets cozy with the Bushes at the old family homestead, what's really on the agenda? Can they really ride out their differences? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garda. President Putin suggested the meeting and was invited to the Bush clan's holiday estate in Maine. They've dressed casually, dined family style, allegedly on lobster, and it's said cracked a few jokes. But can the apparent good cheer really thaw the biggest freeze in US-Russian relations since the Cold War? Well, so far the Russians had VIP treatment, greeted at the airport by former US President George Bush Sr. There's been a family welcome at the compound, plus kisses from Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, a tour of the grounds with current President Bush Jr., and even a speedboat ride. But as both men head towards the end of their terms, and with major differences between them, what are the real issues at stake? Well, President Bush wants to cite a new missile defense system in Eastern Europe. Mr. Putin is fiercely opposed and took the US by surprise last month by suggesting a shared system in Azerbaijan instead. Mr. Bush wants his counterpart to sign up to further sanctions against Iran and its nuclear program. Mr. Putin may be reluctant. Russia and Iran still share strong economic ties. And then there's the issue of Kosovo. Washington backs its bid for independence. The Kremlin does not. There's also been sniping over former Soviet states, with the US extending its influence right to Russia's back doorstep. And the whole issue of democracy and human rights in Russia presents an obstacle in itself. Well, joining us are our guests. From Washington, David Satter. He's a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. From Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, a defense analyst and columnist. And from London, Martin Macaulay, a Russia expert at London University. Mr. Macaulay, if I could start off with you. Lobster, pleasantries, kisses all round. What do you make of the nature of the meeting? And what do you think they're really meeting about?
I think he's been downgraded, because you'd expect him to meet at Camp David for it to be more official. And since it's been downgraded really to a family affair, if nothing comes out of this, then nobody will lose face. They can have a nice, pleasant conversation, and I presume that Vladimir Putin will stick to his opposition to the missile shield, and George Bush will say, no, we want the missile shield, and let's disagree on that one, and let's move on to other things. They disagree on Kosovo. The Russians will not give ground on that either, and they have good relations with Iran and so on. So there's a whole range of issues they can discuss. Apparently they discussed democracy last night and so on, and the American view of democracy is pluralist, whereas Putin's view of democracy really is controlled democracy. You can say Russia really has one view, one particular view of how Russia should be run, and if you disagree with that, if you're a politician, you disagree with that, it classifies you as an extremist, such as Garry Kasparov. So therefore they can talk and smile and so on, but there's a gulf between them.
Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow. Out of all the issues on the agenda, Iran, missile defense, Kosovo, what do you think is of prime importance to Vladimir Putin?
Right now, I believe for Vladimir Putin, the most single important issue is will Russia get the Winter Olympics in Sochi? The decision will be made this week, and Putin is flying directly from Maine to Guatemala for the meeting of International Olympic Committee. And right now, that's the main issue for him, and actually for Russian-Western relations, because if Russia does not get the Olympics, this will be seen as a major Western American-led conspiracy, and relations will nosedive further down. So for Putin, I think this is just a nice stop before the real business, as he sees it, as many Russians see it right now.
Let's talk a little bit about missile defense, Pavel Felgenhauer. Why is Russia so perturbed by US plans for a missile defensive shield in Eastern Europe? Surely it's for defensive reasons, as they say.
Oh, that's a big problem, because right now the West, and especially the United States, cannot apparently cannot figure out why is Russia so violently opposed. That's why I believe this meeting was organized. The idea was to cut away Putin from his surroundings, which is supplying him apparently not very true information about American plans, and try and talk to him like person to person. that the Putin's surroundings are just spoiling the relations. Well, really, Putin's recent pronouncements, some of them, seem to be the result of wrong briefings. But of course, he's not a weak president. Vladimir Putin is not a weak president that's surrounded by people who are putting things into his mouth. His surroundings is what he selected. So I believe that this kind of nice personal diplomacy will not really move the issues.
David Satter in Washington, what do you make of missile defense? Is it really that much of a problem?
Well, it's a problem because the Russian side seeks to make it a problem. It ought not to be a problem because the scale of the missile defense system that's being envisaged is very modest. It certainly can't affect the Russian missile attack force, which consists of hundreds of missiles and thousands of warheads. And in fact, the Russians are quick to boast that, in fact, their missiles can penetrate any anti-missile system. I think that, in fact, what is at stake is the idea that the former members of the Warsaw Pact are free to make their own alliances and free to participate in the military and defensive plans of the United States and the new Western alliance to which they belong. Russia doesn't recognize that they have that freedom of action. It's during the Soviet time, decisions were not made in Warsaw, Prague, Sofia, Berlin, Kiev, Tallinn, or Tbilisi. They were all made in Moscow, and Russia simply has not adapted to a new situation in which these countries are now independent. They're free to make their own decisions.
Yeah, interesting. Now let's move on to one of the issues also on a parallel to that. With regards to Iran, Martin Macaulay, regarding Iran, is Russia likely to be nudged by the US into taking a different line over more sanctions against the Islamic Republic?
Yes, I think that George Bush will do his best to win Vladimir Putin's support for more sanctions, harder sanctions on Iran, because he's got a presidential election coming up and he doesn't want to be seen to be weak over Iran, and there are voices in America calling for drastic action, even dropping a bomb on the Iranians if they don't stop enriching uranium and so on. So this has been going on. It went under Yeltsin, under the famous Clinton-Yeltsin Act. Clinton kept on asking Yeltsin to desist from helping the Iranians and so on. There's a long-running saga, and it's quite unlikely that Vladimir Putin will in fact say to George Bush, "You're absolutely right, we've got it all wrong." In fact, they will say, Iran is not the threat that you think it is, and we don't think that your missile shield or in fact what you think about Iran is in fact correct, and you're overreacting, calm down. Iran is not the threat that you think it is.
Pavel Falgenhauer in Moscow, what do you think of the Iranian situation? Is Putin going to go along with the US and its allies?
Well, of course, Russia does not want a nuclear-capable Iran. That's the official position. On the other side of it, Moscow is not that much afraid of Iran becoming stronger and maybe actually acquiring a nuclear missile. So right now, this is a bargaining chip. Actually, last month, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, speaking to journalists in Moscow, more or less linked the Iranian nuclear issue with missile defense in Europe, sort of implying that if the United States puts on hold its plans to develop missile defense in Poland and the Czech Republic, then Russia will be more cooperative on Iran. And if not, well, then not. So right now, I would see there is a link there.
Now, whereas most world leaders come to the White House for talks, this time the setting is more personal. The Bush's summer retreat in Kennebunkport, Maine. Bush and Putin's relationship might be frosty right now, but when they first met in Slovenia in 2001, Bush was optimistic about the meeting.
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul. He's a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country.
We're joined again by our guest from Washington, David Satter. He is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. From Moscow, Pavel Falgenhauer, a defense analyst and columnist. And from London, Martin Macaulay, a Russia expert at London University. David Satter, if I could ask for your reaction. Looking back at 2001, obviously 9/11 occurred shortly after that meeting between Putin and Bush. Just how much has changed since that first meeting, and how has it influenced the relationship?
Well, what's changed is that the illusions which were entertained at the time of that meeting have become to a certain extent discredited by Russia's own behavior. It's a separate question whether those illusions should have ever been entertained in the first place. But under existing circumstances, it's very hard to believe that there's something remarkable about Putin's soul, or that in fact he has the best interests of his country at heart. Because the best interests of his country consist of entirely different things than the things that he's doing. For example, cooperating in the development of the nuclear potential of Iran. It's something which, from the point of view of any rational calculation of the Russian national interest, simply does not make sense.
And apart from a relationship, I'm sorry to interrupt you, apart from a relationship with Iran, let's talk about China as well. Is it of concern to the Bush administration that Russia and China have a more than healthy relationship at present?
Well, of course it's of some concern, but that's not the most urgent concern at the moment. Russia is China's major supplier of arms, but China lately has turned a more pacific face to the outside world, is less belligerent than it was even in the recent past. In any case, the principal issue right now is Islamic extremism, the support of terrorist groups by Iran, the ambition of Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Those questions are rightly preoccupying Washington and the Bush administration.
Let's move on to Pavel Falgenhauer in Moscow. Let's talk a little bit about Russian-Chinese agreements. Noam Chomsky is quoted as saying the Shanghai Cooperation Organization seems to be turning into a NATO-style organization aimed at Central Asia to confront the United States. Do you think that's what Russia's intention is?
Oh, well, there's a lot of talk about that in Moscow, though, of course, this organization is somewhat different. And actually, of course, the interests of Russia and China do coincide on that both powers want a stable Central Asia because it's a source of strategic materials for Russia, of course, and also for China. But I don't believe that right now Beijing would want to actually threaten in any way or its very special relationships with the United States to confront the United States over Central Asia or support Russia somewhere in the Caucasus or in Central Asia against the United States. So there's a lot of kind of wishful thinking in Moscow about what this Shanghai organization can achieve. And there's a lot of posturing. The Chinese are sort of demonstrating that they have great allies that will support them, say if something happens over Taiwan. The Russians say we have China behind us in Central Asia against the Americans, but mostly that's hot words, not actions yet.
Martin Macaulay in London, is Russia trying to develop some sort of Eastern counterweight to the US and NATO?
Yes, I think they are, because they look at China, they look at India. They also look at Brazil as the developing countries of the future. And China is its own savior. China doesn't need really an alliance, a military alliance, an economic alliance with anyone. It needs good relations, good economic relations with the United States, because that's where the goods are going and that's where the investment is coming. But the Russians are putting together gas deals to transfer gas to China, and they will link economically the two countries. And there are even Russians who think in 50 years' time that Siberia will be shared between China and Russia. So China is extremely important for Russia, but I think the dominant partner at present I would see as China, and China would be very wary, as Pavel said, of getting into any agreement which would antagonize, for instance, the Americans, or leaving them less room for maneuver, because if you look at Chinese foreign policy, it's really economic foreign policy. They're going around Africa, they're going around South America. everywhere, picking up oil and gas and raw materials and so on. That is their main objective. They are not there to, in fact, antagonize politically or militarily any of the great powers. They're going to be drawn into Africa because they want to stay out of politics, they want to stay out of Darfur, but they will have to get involved politically sometime. So therefore, the great power, of course, is China. Then comes India, and India again is developing, and it needs to develop its relations, economic relations, with the dominant Western countries, and not to antagonize the United States. So I would see Russia being the weaker of the two, Russia and China, and India coming together. Russia would like that triangle. They've been talking about that triangle, forming a kind of counterweight against what they call the hegemony of the United States. But at present, economically, neither India nor China has really any interest in antagonizing the Americans.
David Satter in Washington, Amon Macaulay mentioned the issue of oil and gas. What about the U.S. thirst for oil and gas reserves in former Soviet states? Surely it's stepping on Russia's toes?
I'm sorry, what is stepping on Russia's toes? The American policy?
The American thirst for oil and gas reserves in Central Asian states. Surely Russia can't be too happy about it.
Oh, well, the United States doesn't get its oil and gas from Central Asia. The fact is that Russia wants to control those reserves, and there is some competition as far as American private oil companies are concerned, which would like to participate in developing them. But that's the normal way in commercial relations, and is not really remarkable. If the Russians are upset about that, they're upset about something which is once again demonstrates their tendency to see the former Soviet republics as still their possessions.
Pavel Falgenhauer in Moscow, you disagree?
Yes, I would mostly I would agree with that. There are problems seen from Moscow as a kind of that there's again a conspiracy to take away what we believe is our backyard. And there are actually very commercial interests involved. And you should understand that the Russian present political leadership is very commercialized. I mean, apparently Putin and, of course, many of his close circle have big stocks in Russian gas and oil companies, and they're very much interested in controlling Central Asian reserves, especially of gas, because Russia right now has very big contracts for many years to supply gas to Western Europe, but Russian gas production is not enough, and we right now have a kind of shortage inside Russia. And the best way is to cover it with gas from Central Asia, buying it cheap there and selling it for several times more in Europe. And so it's very important for us right now from Moscow to see and control the exit of gas, especially gas, oil, but especially gas from Central Asia. That's seen as crucial. And mostly it's, I would say, sort of commercial issues connected to the Kremlin. So these are commercial political problems.
David Satter in Washington, what about the issue of Kosovo? I know there's a lot of debate about it. I've got a quote from Russian expert Sergei Karaganov, the head of Foreign and Defense Policies Council. He said about Kosovo that Russia doesn't want to open up a Pandora's box for all unrecognized states. Do you think he has a point?
I'm not sure what he means by that, because in fact Russia is sponsoring the breakaway republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia. I think that the Russian behavior over this issue has been extremely opportunistic. It's very difficult to see what the Russian principles are. On the one hand, they oppose the secession of Chechnya, but support the secession of Abkhazia and South Ossetia from Georgia. They oppose theoretically the secession of Kosovo from, or the establishment of an independent country of Kosovo, its secession from Serbia, although in fact the relations between the Albanians and the Serbs are now at such a point that resisting independence for Kosovo could lead to major conflicts in that part of the world, and which is one of the reasons that NATO is so anxious to establish a framework under which Kosovo can detach itself from Serbia.
All right, I'd like to ask Martin Macaulay his opinion on this. I apologize for interrupting.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask Martin Macaulay for his opinion. Do you think Russia have been opportunistic over the issue of Kosovo?
Yes, they've been playing a double game because on the one hand they are supporting Serbia and say they will only accede to the independence of Kosovo if Serbia agrees to that. And that's like saying that snow will never melt at the North Pole. That's not going to happen. But at the same time, as David Satter has said, they've been supporting the secessionists in Abkhazia and South Ossetia to undermine Georgia. It's potentially very dangerous for Russia because they don't want a precedent. Because if you, in fact, give independence to Kosovo, it breaks away. You allow Abkhazia and South Ossetia to join the Russian Federation, leave Georgia, then you could have a precedent. You would have a precedent, say, for Tatarstan or Bashkortostan or some other autonomous republic within inside Russia saying the same thing. We would like to be independent because Tatarstan and Bashkortostan are oil rich, and they would like to control that. And who's to say that Yakutia, Sakha-Yakutia in Siberia, which is oil rich and diamonds and so on, that they will say, well, we would like to control our territory and so on. So potentially, it's a very dangerous game for Moscow.
Very dangerous game for them. Pavel Falkenhauer, are the US playing a dangerous game by criticizing Russia in many ways with regards to lack of democracy, human rights record, targeting of journalists? Do you think that many Russians see the US as playing double standards there?
Well, at least the Kremlin does, and this has created a lot of ill feeling. The Kremlin sees the West as sort of ganging up against the regime, and at the time when the Putin regime is at a very important watershed. I mean, Putin has announced that he's going to retire. He's going to appoint a successor president, I know, like in the Roman Empire. And this is a very, very tense moment for Putin personally, for his surroundings, and because there are different tensions between different groups there. And if something goes wrong with the succession, this could destabilize the situation in Russia. And actually, some people from the Kremlin could go to Siberia and to a prison camp. Right now, at this very important moment, criticism of democracy from the West is seen as a kind of attempt to sort of wedge into Russian internal affairs when these internal affairs are at a very critical point.
Martin Macaulay in London, Dr. Falkenhauer, sorry to interrupt you. Martin Macaulay in London, both men, Bush and Putin, won't be at the helm of their respective countries come the end of 2008. What sort of legacy do you think they're leaving for future Russia-US relations? Can there be good relations?
I think it's going to be difficult because the man who follows Putin will have to continue along the hard line. He will have to show himself a strong president. If it's Ivanov with his background in security affairs, he will just be as hard as Putin. And Russia wants the United States to respect them. Russia wants to be seen as the equal of the United States and so on. The Americans will not concede that because to them other countries are much more important. For instance, China, and George Bush will pass away, and the new man in Moscow may in fact take a less positive attitude towards Russia and say, well, basically...
Martin Macaulay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've got to get concluding comments from David Satter and Pavel Falkenhauer. David Satter, are friendly relations possible? Very quickly.
Yes, they are. They're possible and they're necessary, but it requires changes in the Russian behavior.
Pavel Falkenhauer, is a new Cold War imminent, or can we have good relations?
Not maybe a Cold War, but there's going to be a real crisis of Russian-American relations, and I don't believe that it can be solved before there's a change of power in Washington and Moscow. Maybe when there are new presidents here and there, there'll be a possibility.
Pavel Falkenhauer, I'm going to have to stop you there. Thank you
leaf.
very much for joining us, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us here on Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.